All right. Well, thank you and hello, everybody. This is me, Alyssa Miller. For those of you that don't know me, I'm a hacker and a researcher first and foremost. I've been hacking in some form or fashion since I was 12 years old and got a paper route to buy my first computer and started hacking Prodigy for anyone that's old enough to remember those online services. I do a lot of research into just different areas that interest me. I'm also a security advocate, and specifically these days, an application security advocate for a company called Sneak. Basically means I like to get out to conferences when we have them live or when we do them now virtually, and just talk to people about security topics, share my ideas, hear other people's ideas, challenge each other, and see how we can grow as a community and so forth. Um, I'm also an author and a blogger. I'm currently working on a book about entry into cybersecurity careers and hopefully a guide to help people do that. I do blog to my website, which I will give you a link later. And then finally, for those of you that don't know, I'm also the co-host of a podcast called The Uncommon Journey on ITSP Magazine. So myself, Chloe Mastagi, and Philip Wiley host a podcast dedicated to sharing the unique stories of how people get into information security. But today I'm going to take you on a journey, and it's a journey of sight and sound. This is normally the time when I would ask who's been to a fun house before. So I can tell the story of when I was, about 6 years old, and my parents took us to this place in Wisconsin called the Wisconsin Dells. And we went to this thing they called a fun house. And I never understood why they called it a fun house. It was basically a maze that was designed to toy with all of my senses. I would run around trying to figure out how to get out of this place, and it was filled with optical illusions and things that made it so I couldn't trust my own senses to try to find the exit to this fun house. And what we're seeing today in terms of security is this same type of attack has become a new paradigm, if you will, of attacks for people who seek to do harm. What are we talking about? We're talking about deep fakes. And when I say deep fakes, first of all, I'm talking about any artificial media created by deep learning neural networks. So it could be video, which is most commonly what people think of when I say deep fakes, but it could also be audio or it can just be still images. Indeed, it actually started with the idea of just creating these ultra realistic still images, again, using deep learning neural networks to generate this media. Now, where did it begin? Well, it began, of course, with researchers, but it started to come to prominence in the same place that most technology that we know of to, or that has any real value in our world today started. It actually started with the porn industry. So technology started to show up and websites started to show up where they were creating porn videos that appeared to be famous celebrities like you see Natalie Portman or Gal Gadot or Natalie Dormer or Emma Watson here. They would just take normal pornographic videos with their usual porn actresses and just replace the faces of those actresses with the faces of these celebrities. And indeed, the results were very convincing. You can still go out there today. You can find all sorts of websites that do this. And I'm told that you can even custom order, I'm sure for a price, a specific celebrity to show up in a particular deepfake porn video. But it didn't take long before we moved out of just the porn industry, and the applicability of deepfakes to politics started to become a well-recognized threat. You see some examples of some deepfake videos that have been produced here. You might also be familiar with one that was created in 2018 by Jordan Peele, where he is imitating Barack Obama. And so you see a video of Barack Obama saying some less than complimentary things about, Donald Trump, Ben Carson, basically the entire Republican Party. Um, and that's kind of where it's grown to prominence. But we've seen a lot of this in the media today, and it's growing. and the videos are becoming more and more realistic. So definitely the applicability of this to politics is concerning. And people have covered this. There's a lot of people doing talks on this, how, coming up on 2020 here, what deepfakes are going to mean in terms of our political discourse. But there are other issues with deepfakes, other threats that we need to be aware of. From a social engineering perspective, that ability to create ultra-realistic audio using deep learning neural networks is an issue. Indeed, a few years ago, we saw an example of this when a energy company in the UK was subject to an attack where the CEO of that company was basically tricked into wiring a large sum of money, I believe about 2 million euros, to attackers because a deep faked audio recording was used to convince him to transmit this money using the voice of the president of the parent company. And so they were able to trick him into transferring money into an account owned by the attackers. And so when we start to think business in terms of deep fakes, this opens up a whole new threat landscape. We can start thinking about extortion. Now, obviously, this particular scenario you see used as an example here was not deep fakes. From everything I understand, I don't believe Jeff Bezos has ever denied that the videos that were used in his extortion case were real. It was videos and pictures, but it certainly wouldn't take much, and it's not a big leap to think of the ability to use a deepfake video to extort a particular high-ranking official somewhere, whether it's in business or in government. You don't necessarily need it to be real. You just need it to look real enough to convince enough people to have an impact on politics or on that particular business. But when we talk business, I also like to introduce this idea of what I call outsider trading. So we all understand the idea of insider trading. You know, stocks are running short. You're going to buy them up because there's a big announcement coming that's going to send stocks soaring. So you use that insider knowledge. But what about this scenario? Let's take one of my favorite people to pick on, Elon Musk. And let's say Tesla's getting ready to launch their latest model. We'll call it the Model Q. And the night before the launch, a deep fake video surfaces on the web of Elon Musk supposedly talking to a group of investors, telling them about all the problems with the line. Well, what happens? Of course, the stocks are going to plummet. Now, the next day, the launch goes as planned. Elon Musk takes a sledgehammer, smashes a few windows, or does what he does, and the stocks recover. Well, if that attacker in that midterm bought up those stocks at that artificially shortened price, now you have this case where an outsider with no knowledge really of anything internal to the company, just regular public knowledge, is able to manipulate stock prices and raise their portfolio. Now, if I can do that with a company the size of Tesla, what about entire industries? Could I go after the entire energy industry, for instance? Or if I can manipulate an entire market, what about the economies of small countries? So the threats of this can be pretty wide-ranging. But moving beyond just the idea of creating deepfakes and convincing people that someone did something they didn't do, what about the opposite case? What about that situation where video surfaces of, say, a certain politician who tends to stretch the truth anyway, and that video surfaces and it's totally legit, but that politician, in order to refute it, just claims that it was a deep fake. It wasn't me. How do we prove that that particular video was indeed that politician? And so there's a lot of concern as deep fakes start to attack our senses, the very things that we use to measure what is real and what is not in the world around us. This is where this threat comes to play. This is this new paradigm of attack that, we moved from attacking technology to attacking people. We've been attacking people for years. We've been talking about this human element. Well, that human element now, we're attacking the very raw basics of what inherently makes us us, and that's our ability to perceive the world around us. So what is real anymore? How do we define real? if it's the things we can feel, we can smell, we can taste, what happens when we can't trust those signals that are coming into our brain anymore? This is what we see as we start looking at the potential future of what deepfakes mean to us. Now, let's take a step back. Let's use this as our transition. Let's start to talk about how do we create these things? So we've got these crazy, believable images, videos, audio that we're seeing. How are we creating them? Well, we use this thing we call a GAN, and GAN stands for Generative Adversarial Network. If you break down that term, it makes a lot of sense. Generative, we're creating something. We're going to generate, say, a video. It's adversarial in that there's actually two neural networks that are competing within this model. And so what you see is there's, first of all, a generator. The generator is responsible for creating the images. You also have a discriminator, and the discriminator is responsible for determining if those images are realistic or not. We train both sides of this equation with a training set of images. And what happens then is the generator is going to take a target media. So here you've got video of an actor sitting in place of Barack Obama. The generator takes a frame from that video, tries to create a frame that looks like Barack Obama, and the discriminator is going to say, yeah, either that looks real or it doesn't. But when the discriminator says, hey, that doesn't look real, it doesn't just say it's not real. It's now updating the algorithm for the generator to help the generator learn how to do it better. So what does this look like if we break it down a little bit more? Well, within this space, we have this encoder and decoder. And what's happening is that generator has an encoder, which is taking that image, and it's trying to encode that into a numerical, mathematical representation of that face. So it's looking at 68 points of facial recognition to identify how the face is aligned and where images show up on the face. It's looking at various characteristics, and it's trying to encode that all into this mathematical representation. Then it passes it to a decoder, and all that decoder tries to do is recreate that same image. The discriminator now looks at that and says, is that real or fake? And it's going to calculate what we call loss. And loss is basically just a measure of how well did the decoder do in creating that face. So the decoder is just taking that mathematical representation and trying to generate a face from it. Now, the loss tells us about how we're doing, and it's a mathematical calculation. And then the discriminator updates what is ultimately the model, that representation that the encoder or that the decoder is using to create faces, and it updates what we call weights. And the weights are what manipulate the mathematical representations of the faces in these images. So as this occurs in this cycle, you've got the case of the generator is constantly getting better because the discriminators help making it better, but the discriminator is also getting better at recognizing differences between the faces. And so it's this constant flow. Now, when I'm going to generate a model for what we call conversion, there's really two steps. So there's this first, the idea of training. So training is really taking that training set, and I'm going to create the model that I use to generate images. So I'm actually using two training sets. I'm using the target, which is the person whose face I want to replace, and I'm using images of the subject, who's the person whose face I want to insert into the video. Now, instead of training separate encoders, I'm actually training the same encoder. So I've got the same encoder trying to develop one mathematical model that can represent either face. And then I have separate decoders, decoder A, which will create my face. Decoder B, as you see here, is set up to create the face of Alyssa Milano. Now, they're both using the data from the same encoder. So the goal is to get this encoder and this mathematical model built that either decoder can use it to generate a face with the same characteristics. Only one is creating my face, the other is creating Alyssa Milano. Now, when it comes time to convert, which is the actual generation of that video, or in this case, each frame by frame creating that video. So we take that image, we take that still frame, we pass it to the encoder. The encoder creates the model, generates the mathematical model for that particular image. But now we take my image, encode it, and we pass it to decoder B, which is actually going to create Alyssa Milano's face in that scene. And this is how ultimately we're creating deep fakes. It is literally frame by frame, and we're then overlaying the same audio. Now you also see this box here, and that box is important because that's what we call the mask. And that's what we're capturing, and that's the actual area that we're going to attempt to replace within the video. One of the things to understand is when we capture this box for training and for converting, these algorithms have to standardize the size of that box because we need a standard size face with all the different landmarks in it. And so it's using a square 1:1 aspect ratio to do this. And typically where we started was 64 pixels by 64 pixels. As we've grown in this space, those captures have grown. 384 pixels now is pretty common, but it's important to understand that all of that has to be standardized because it applies to then when we try to detect deep fakes. One of the earliest ways to detect deep fakes was simply when we tried to apply this image to a deep fake video, and distortions occurred because we had a stretch of face. That's pretty easy to understand, but it's also, as the technology's improved, it's gotten better and better. So then we expanded. We started looking at eye blinking because we found that training sets for the subject often didn't include images of that person blinking. Think about it. What images do you normally have of yourself on the web? You don't normally share images where your eyes were closed. And so what we found was deepfakes weren't generating eye blinks at the same rate. They were sometimes as much as a minute or two apart. So there was research done on that. A research paper was released, as you see here, by the University at Albany. And within months of that, we started seeing deepfakes that could generate eye blinks. So then they started analyzing the speed and velocities and directions of eye blinks. And that's kind of been that same back and forth competition here. But as the attackers get better, the defenders get better, and vice versa. One of the other challenges that's allowed for easy detection thus far is what I mentioned about this standardized sizing. So when I'm trying to produce a video, you can see here we've put Steve Buscemi's face on Sharon Stone from the movie everybody knows. And you can see from far away, this looks pretty realistic. So think again in terms of, a 64 by 64 pixel image, inserting that into a video where the actual size of the face is pretty small because the camera's panned out. Well, that's pretty easy, and I can make that look pretty realistic. But what happens later in the scene when the camera zooms in on her face? Now we can see all the distortions. We can see the difference in resolution between Steve Buscemi's eyes and, say, her hair. This makes it a lot easier then to detect. But again, as those standardized images that we're capturing get larger and larger, this becomes less and less of an issue, and it becomes harder and harder to detect. So researchers have moved on, and we're now starting to study behaviors. What are those things? What are those facial tics, those expressions that people make when they're talking about topics of a certain emotional quality? Well, how does Barack Obama look when he's speaking about something that has him angry versus he's sad versus, he's trying to convey a very serious message? When does he raise his eyebrows? And so we're seeing a lot of studies being done around this. Now, Dartmouth did this last year, and they boasted 95% detection rate. They were able to detect in 95% of the cases accurately that it was a deep fake. They expect that to be 99% by the time we get to the 2020 election. So this is a really promising new way because it's a lot more difficult when I'm trying to generate a deep fake to get all of those reactions the same. But if I can train my actor who's sitting in, who is ultimately the target that is going to get replaced out of that video, to make the correct facial behaviors, I can start to account for this, and suddenly those behavioristic analysis aren't so effective. But I mentioned before, how do we handle it when somebody claims that a less than savory video of them is fake? Researchers are also doing a lot of work with digital watermarks, where the camera producing that particular video is watermarking the images. Now, of course, this works until you recreate that video. You regenerate it by passing it through an encoder a second time. You need to come up with the technology to persist those watermarks and so forth. So a simple CRC might not work. And so there's a lot of research being done around this. There's a number of different prototypes that have been created, but this is research that continues. Thinking in terms of prevention, researchers are also working with what they call adversarial perturbations. Basically, what this means is we're injecting visually undetectable noise into images and into videos that ultimately prevent the facial recognition algorithms that deepfakes rely on from being able to accurately detect faces. And you see some of those results here. That top line, you see what the original image looked like. The second line, you see the same image with those perturbations injected in, and you see that all these green squares are where it thinks it's identifying a face. And you can see in that bottom line then the types of noise that's being injected. So there's lots of technological solutions to how we can address deepfakes, how we can start to identify them. But the fact of the matter is, deepfakes are not a technology problem. They are misinformation, and misinformation is a human problem. We have to start thinking about the human element. We do this in every area of security. We talk about it all the time. Indeed, RSA this year, their whole theme was the human element. And so when we start thinking about deepfakes, we have to think about it in terms of how do we address the human problem. The problem with misinformation, as we are all learning, in particular from our political discourse in countries around the world, is that it's sticky. The way misinformation works is misinformation plays on our predisposed thoughts, beliefs, and perceptions. And it writes a story that fits into a logic chain that we can build in our minds around what we already believe, those thoughts that already exist in our head. And so that misinformation just becomes part of this logic chain, which makes it very, very difficult to remove. Once it's inserted into that logic chain in our brain, trying to supplant that misinformation is incredibly difficult. But there are steps for how we can do this. When we seek to debunk misinformation, the very first thing we have to do, and this we've been pretty good at as a society, is just calling out the fact that there is misinformation and that this is not real information. That's fairly easy to do. So we think about, this is the role that detection plays when we talk about deepfakes. Detection is what's going to tell us, hey, that video is fake. We can have YouTube and Facebook and whatever put the alerts up there. We're seeing that already with fake news, right? But then we have to continually repeat that story over and over, that this is misinformation. We have to put that warning out there, but we have to repeat it over and over and over again. Now, we can do that. That's pretty easy through the media. But this is the challenging part now that often gets missed and is the hardest part that researchers are still working on. We have to take that misinformation now and replace it with an alternate narrative that still ties into that same logic chain. So it's not enough just to say, this is fake, here's the real story. It's, how do I present that real story in a way that's going to fill that gap that I'm going to create if I pull that myth out of the logic chain? Otherwise, what happens is that person just continues to retain that myth, and they don't see the new logic, and it doesn't fit, and it doesn't become a plausible story in their mind. We have to create that alternative narrative that fits. And this is the challenge that is going to continue to plague us for years to come, is how do we do that effectively? Because it requires understanding who the audience is that's accepting that false message, and how do we speak to them in a way that our truthful narrative is going to fit into their predisposed beliefs, their prejudices, and so forth. So we think about deepfakes, and this all sounds really scary. But there are some positives. So you might ask yourself, why are we creating deep fakes? What possible good use is there? There are some good ways that this technology is already being leveraged. First, for the Star Wars fans like me out there, you recognize these two images. This technology was used to create a young Princess Leia, to bring back Grand Moff Tarkin into those episodes of the latest batch of Star Wars movies. Without it, yeah, we could have done some CGI, it might have worked, but it probably wouldn't have been as realistic, and it definitely wouldn't have been as effective and efficient as it was using deepfake technology. We're also seeing this form of GAN learning, this deep neural network learning, in medical imaging. So GANs are actually able to identify and predict growth patterns of tumors in a brain from just simple MRIs much more accurately than any doctor out there. And so researchers are really working with us to try to build that out. We're also seeing this technology come into play in terms of some augmented reality. So where we're seeing things like here, this is a proposed telehealth approach where there would be a new augmented reality, and you would, this is not even a real human being that you're looking at. You're now interacting with somebody, but the image you're seeing is a deep fake generated person that isn't actually even a human being at all. And then finally, taking it back to politics, one way that we've seen this already is this individual who's a politician in India. And his constituency spans, for anyone that knows India, you know there's many, many dialects to the language they speak in India. And as a result, his constituency applies across, I think, like 14 different dialects. So he recorded a speech and was then able to use deepfake technology to translate that so that he was delivering it in the native tongue of each of these dialects that exist within his overall constituency. And it was incredibly effective, and his popularity soared as a result. So as I start to wrap up, I'm going to leave you with this quote from Yuri Bezmenov. He's a former KGB agent, and this really goes to the heart of some of the threats of deep fake. When I can change people's perceptions of reality to the point that they don't know what to trust anymore, the ability to manipulate their minds is overwhelming. And indeed, this quote comes from 1984, when the then Soviet Union was engaged in mass brainwashing. So this is a great summary, in my mind, to what deepfakes could truly mean for us. Now, a couple things that I will share with you. You saw some of the work that I've been doing in terms of deepfakes. I have been generating deepfake videos on my own. If you want more information, you can definitely check out this hashtag. As far as I know, I'm the only one using it. I've checked it a few times. I haven't found it anywhere else. You can see that first link there is an example of one of the deepfake videos I produced. You'll see that it does highly illustrate the limitations. I am definitely getting better at generating them, but it is not a simple process. So if there's any silver lining here, it's that it does take quite a bit of work to create these. You can also follow the hashtag on LinkedIn, and you'll see I share some of the training process stats and other things. I also share it on Twitter, so you can follow the same hashtag there. Obviously, I can share a little more detail on LinkedIn because I'm not limited to 280 characters, but follow those as well, and you'll get to hear more about what I'm doing. You can hear about the hardware that I'm using, the software that I'm using, and so forth. And certainly, I'm happy to engage with you folks there as well. Briefly, some other references if you'd like to know more about deepfakes. The one that I will mention that is not here, and I apologize for not adding it, but something else to check out is the MIT course on deep learning. They did make this public. You can watch videos from all of their from all of their lectures. Just do a search for MIT Introduction to Deep Learning, and it'll take you there. I believe it's introductiontodeeplearning.com is the website, but if you just Google it, you'll get there. Really great topic, definitely expands beyond deepfakes, talks about deep learning concepts in general. And then finally, I welcome you to continue the conversation with me. Easiest way for sure, if you want to get in touch with me and talk more about this or really any security topic, reach out to me on Twitter. My LinkedIn address is also there. Feel free to follow me there. Certainly happy to connect with anybody who would like to. If there's anything I can do to try to connect you with folks to help you in a career search or getting into security, please let me know. And then finally, my blog, alyssasec.com. Feel free to check me out there. My speaking schedule is up there, although I will admit right now, since everything's gone virtual, I haven't done a good job of keeping it up to date. I will be fixing that shortly, but certainly feel free to find me there. And with that, I want to say thank you so much to everybody who's attended. Definitely a great big thank you to Grim and Scythe for having me as a part of this conference. And of course, to my employer for sponsoring some time to actually sit here with you guys today as well. So with that, Bryson, I will turn it back to you. And I intentionally left plenty of time here for questions if there are any.
Sure. So the first question is, how do we mitigate the effect of deepfakes without giving the fake information any credibility?
And that's the challenge, right? Because the minute it shows up, it has instant credibility. And we look at kind of that bar that we've set as society for proof. You think about in terms of like a court of law, for instance, when we're looking for evidence, we think about video as kind of like right up there at the top of, okay, that's a high level of proof if we're talking about evidence in a court of law. And so we're going to see, by spreading awareness of deepfakes, there's going to become the need for more skepticism around that. So that's the start. It's, again, going back to that human element, we really have to address it at a societal and cultural level that people need to understand these exist, which I think they do to some degree. And it's the challenge that we're having all over the place with misinformation right now. How do we get people to think more critically about the information that they're perceiving and not just take it at face value that, okay, this is real? The challenge, of course, is that's not an easy thing to do. If I go back to the Nancy Pelosi video, the infamous Nancy Pelosi video, which wasn't even a deep fake, that was literally, they just took a video of her and slowed it down to make it appear that she was inebriated. Even after it was well publicized in the media across the board, all sides of the fence, it was still seeing massive shares and people posting it, believing and spreading the information that it was real. And so again, it's not a short-term answer. It's a long-term focus on education and awareness that this is what deepfakes are. This is what they can be used to do. The good news is we're kind of ahead of the curve still, because it does take us a fair amount of effort to create a convincing deepfake. They can be generated pretty easily, but to create one that's actually studio quality and really believable is still pretty tough.
What is the biggest threat from deepfakes in your view? An example, a fake Trump video.
I mean, I think right now it's, definitely the political arena, I think, is where it's going to be the most prominent threat right now. But I honestly see that threat to the business market being a longer term, actually worse threat than even politics. In politics, people tend to be skeptical. We know there's misinformation going on. Where that's kind of the top of the curve or the front of the curve right now. People get it in politics. Business, no one, I've not seen a lot of people who are talking about deepfake talking about the impact of business. And so I don't know that there's necessarily the same awareness. And politics, we have these long cycles, right? The news cycle's shortening, but we have this long cycle of, okay, I have time for a video to come out. It's going to take a while for it to impact public opinion. I also have time before the election to change that public opinion. So, we have that long cycle to react to. Like the the example I used here with Tesla, it could be the night before, and you could completely manipulate a stock price the next day, because we've seen that indeed on Wall Street, how quickly Wall Street reacts to bad news. And so that's where I see the most significant threat's going to be in the near future. Potentially longer term, as we get better, the technology becomes easier to create these. This could really fall to a consumer level, where we see things like revenge porn and that sort of thing being leveraged as a result of this, where people, to get back at somebody, are creating fake pornography videos or creating other fake videos of them in compromising situations, whatnot. Um, Again, right now at a consumer level, the technology's not there. There's a website called Deepfakes Web where you can upload videos and training images, and it will create a video for you. I've tried it a few times, and the results aren't very good. It also costs money. So, the more money it costs, of course, can be a potential hurdle as well.
Are you going to be available on the expert track on Discord for a few more questions?
Yep, I will definitely jump over to Discord after this, and I will be in the expert track ready to discuss further if people have questions about this, or any of the other stuff that I'm working on or whatever.
Well, really appreciate your talk today. That was very fascinating.
I appreciate it. Thank you, and thank you everybody who attended today.